Perfect. We can create a full story for this. I'll structure it in 4 parts, each a separate paragraph, around 800 words per part, in English without Chinese or Japanese names, and keep it engaging. Here's Part 1. Part 1. The baby dragon shivered beneath a jagged cliff, its tiny wings folded uselessly against its trembling body. The storm above was relentless, lightning illuminating the jagged peaks in brief, terrifying bursts. Its parents, massive and proud, had abandoned it days ago, leaving it behind when the winds of an early hunt swept the younglings down into the valley. Hunger clawed at its belly, and fatigue weighed on its limbs. Every roar it tried to muster cracked into a pitiful squeak, unheard over the storm's fury. Nights had grown colder, and the once promising emerald scales of its body were now dulled by rain and mud. The world it had known, the warmth of its family, had vanished, replaced by a cruel isolation that left the little dragon doubting whether life itself had any intention of sparing it. It wandered through broken rocks and thorned brush, the relentless drizzle soaking its body and chilling it to the core. The smell of distant pine and smoke teased its senses, hinting at civilization far below. Tiny claws left shallow prints in wet soil as it stumbled forward, driven by some instinctive pull toward warmth, light, or hope. Though hope had become a foreign word, fragile as a dried leaf in the wind. Its cries for aid drew only echoes from the cliff walls, mocking it. Other creatures passed silently, sensing vulnerability and staying away. Predators might have sniffed the air and decided the hatchling was not worth the risk, or perhaps the storm's rage kept them at bay. Regardless, no friend came, no parent returned. Abandoned by the very ones who had promised protection, the little dragon's heart was a storm of fear and despair. Hours passed, and exhaustion finally forced it to a small alcove between 2 large boulders. Rainwater pooled nearby, and the tiny dragon lapped it greedily, trembling. The storm's thunder rattled bones, and the wind tore at fragile wings. It curled into itself, trying to conserve heat, and closed its eyes, certain that this night would mark the end of its short, lonely existence. But as darkness pressed down, a flicker of movement caught its eye. A human figure approached cautiously, holding a large lantern that cast a soft, golden glow against the relentless gray. At first, the hatchling hissed reflexively, tiny flames sputtering, weak and ineffective. It had learned that most humans were threats, creatures capable of terrifying destruction, and it braced for the inevitable strike. But instead, the figure knelt at a careful distance, setting the lantern down with hands that were open, calm, and entirely non-threatening. The human's voice was gentle, almost a whisper beneath the storm's roar. "Easy, little one. I won't hurt you." Every word seemed to vibrate with reassurance, a strange warmth that the baby dragon had almost forgotten existed. The flickering light illuminated the stranger's kind eyes and steady posture. Without a gesture of aggression or a sudden motion, the human extended a hand, palm upward, in a silent offer of comfort. The hatchling stared, small scales quivering, wings twitching, unsure whether to flee or to trust. Minutes stretched like hours as it weighed instinct against this new, inexplicable calm. Hunger, cold, and exhaustion fought with fear, until finally, weakness overcame caution. The tiny dragon stepped forward, claws pressing lightly into mud, and touched the human's hand with a tentative nose nuzzle. The lantern's glow reflected in its wide, frightened eyes. For the first time in days, maybe weeks, the hatchling felt the beginnings of something foreign yet unmistakable: hope. The storm had eased into a drizzling haze by morning, leaving the valley slick with rainwater and scattered debris. The baby dragon remained close to the human stranger, who introduced himself as Corin. He wore a simple cloak and carried a satchel filled with supplies, though nothing compared to the looming task ahead: keeping a frightened, hungry, and abandoned hatchling alive. Corin settled the little dragon on a patch of soft moss near a sheltered overhang and carefully produced some dried meat and water, placing it within reach without forcing the dragon to move. The hatchling eyed the food warily, still unsure whether trust could exist beyond mere survival. Hunger eventually won over caution. With tiny, trembling movements, It sampled the offerings, glancing repeatedly at Corin, who waited patiently and without pressure. This small act of cooperation, a meal shared without coercion, began the fragile foundation of trust. As hours passed, Corin observed the hatchling carefully, noting the delicate fractures along its small wings and faint bruising along its legs. The parent's abandonment had left not only emotional scars but physical vulnerability. He had encountered dragons before in his travels, but never so young, so alone, and so entirely dependent on a human's care. Despite the risks, Corin knew that leaving it here would almost certainly lead to death. There were predators in these mountains, wolves, rogue dragons, even opportunistic human hunters who did not distinguish between young dragons and game. Slowly, he wrapped a soft blanket around the hatchling, speaking quietly, describing the valley, the gentle rise of the mountains, and the distant village below. His calm voice seemed to soothe the baby dragon's nerves. Each word, each patient gesture, each moment without threat allowed the hatchling to relax its tense muscles and accept that not all humans were dangerous. Corin decided they could not remain in the open valley any longer. He began to build a small makeshift shelter using fallen branches, moss, and large leaves, crafting a space warm enough to shield the hatchling from further storms. The dragon, still wary but curious, crept closer, sniffing the materials, brushing scales against Corin's hands. It was the first time it had sought human contact willingly, an acknowledgement that despite fear and pain, a connection could exist beyond instinct. Corin's heart swelled at the fragile trust forming between them. He whispered stories of humans and dragons who had worked together long ago, tales of courage, loyalty, and alliances, letting the hatchling's mind focus on something other than fear and hunger. By the time night fell again, the baby dragon had nestled into the small shelter he had crafted. Its tiny body curled around his forearm as he sat beside it, keeping watch. The following days brought challenges neither had anticipated. Food had to be scavenged from nearby streams and the edge of the forest, always with careful attention to avoid alerting predators. Rainstorms returned unpredictably, flooding the valley floor and forcing Corin to reinforce the shelter repeatedly. The hatchling began to grow more active, testing small jumps, flapping wings tentatively, and even producing sparks of flame when excited or threatened. Corin's hands were always ready to guide, never restrain, allowing the hatchling to learn its own strength without fear of punishment. As they traveled slowly toward the village, he noticed that the hatchling began responding to his cues, soft whistles, gentle taps, and quiet hums, forming a communication that neither entirely human nor entirely dragon, but something uniquely their own. This bond was strengthening every day, a tether of trust forged through patient care and consistent, gentle guidance. One afternoon, while crossing a narrow ridge overlooking the village, Corin and the hatchling encountered a group of scavenger humans. They had rifles slung over shoulders, axes in hand, scanning for anything they could claim. The hatchling hissed, a small flame flickering from its nostrils in alarm, its body bristling with defensive instinct. Corin stepped between the hatchling and the strangers, raising his hands in calm authority. "It's safe. Stand down," he said. His tone carried the certainty of someone who had faced danger before and refused to act recklessly. The humans hesitated, surprised to find a single human protecting a dragon hatchling with such quiet courage. The hatchling, recognizing Corin's calm, allowed its posture to soften, wings lowering slightly. Eventually, the humans moved on, grumbling, leaving Corin and the baby dragon unharmed. The incident marked a turning point. The hatchling understood that its survival did not rely solely on fear or instinct, but could be guided by trust in another being, a truth that had seemed impossible when it had been abandoned by its parents. By the end of the week, the valley seemed less threatening. Corin had created a pattern of safety: shelter by night, careful travel by day, food secured, and constant reassurance. The hatchling began to mimic his gestures, nudging his hand when seeking comfort, curling against him when resting, and even responding to simple whistles with tiny chirps of acknowledgement. Their bond deepened, forming a partnership neither had anticipated, but both now relied upon. In the eyes of the little dragon, Corin was no longer just a human stranger. He had become a lifeline, a guardian, and the first figure of kindness it had ever known. And for Corin, the fragile trust of this abandoned creature reminded him that courage was not always measured by strength, but by the willingness to protect when the world had offered nothing but cruelty. The journey toward the village proved far more perilous than Corin had anticipated. The valley's slopes were steep and slick from rain, the soil loose and treacherous beneath every step. Rocks tumbled unexpectedly, and the hatchling, though growing stronger by the day, sometimes struggled to maintain its balance. Corin stayed close, his hands ready to steady it, his voice calm and encouraging. "Steady, careful. You've got this," he murmured, and each small word seemed to soothe the tiny dragon's nerves. Its wings began to quiver as though testing the air currents, small sparks dancing from its nostrils as frustration flared when it couldn't gain lift. Yet Corin never scolded, never forced it to fly. Instead, he demonstrated, holding his arms out, shifting his body for balance, letting the hatchling mimic him. Slowly, over hours of careful movement and repeated encouragement, the hatchling began short hops and tentative glides, feeling the wind beneath its wings and discovering a strength it had almost forgotten. At midday, they approached a river that cut sharply across the valley floor. The current was swift, swollen by the recent storms. Corin knelt at the edge, testing the shallow stones and calculating the safest route. The hatchling watched, muscles coiled, uncertain whether to trust the crossing. Corin extended a hand, speaking gently, "I'll be right here. Step carefully." Trembling claws tested the first stones. The current tugged, but the hatchling hesitated only briefly before stepping into the water, feeling Corin's presence beside it. Every careful move built confidence. By the time they reached the opposite bank, the hatchling was shaking with exhilaration, tiny flames flickering in delight rather than fear. It chirped softly, brushing against Corin's hand, a silent acknowledgement of the trust that had guided it through danger. As they neared the human settlement, the hatchling's curiosity grew. It crept forward, wings fluttering, eyes wide with wonder at the new smells. Smoke from chimneys, baked bread from early market stalls, and the faint scent of other humans bustling about. Corin moved cautiously, understanding the delicate balance of allowing exploration while ensuring safety. They were both vulnerable. He, a single human with only his wits and knowledge of the terrain. The hatchling, small and defenseless if attacked. Yet their bond allowed them to function as one. The hatchling began responding to subtle cues. A glance from Corin, a gentle hand movement, a quiet hum. Each signal became a language, a shared understanding that allowed them to navigate the unfamiliar streets safely. Even in the village, challenges arose. Children screamed at first sight of the small dragon. Merchants dropped baskets of produce in alarm, and a few adults raised weapons instinctively. But Corin's calm demeanor and the hatchling's cautious, unthreatening presence soon transformed fear into fascination. He explained softly to anyone who would listen, demonstrating that the hatchling posed no danger, only seeking food, shelter, and kindness. Slowly, wary humans began to lower their arms, intrigued by the tiny creature perched trustingly on Corin's shoulder or tucked into the crook of his arm. The hatchling, for the first time in its life, felt acceptance from beings other than Corin. It chirped and tested the village's attention, flapping wings briefly, exhaling tiny embers that left soft sparks in the sunlight. People began to murmur excitedly, children edging closer, curiosity overcoming fear. That evening, Corin found a safe corner of the village, a small abandoned shed with a roof mostly intact, providing shelter from the sudden drizzle. He spread blankets and arranged a small fire pit outside for warmth and protection. The hatchling immediately explored the space, sniffing, brushing scales along the walls, and finally curling up against Corin once more. "You're safe now," he said, brushing its tiny head. The hatchling chirped in acknowledgement, tiny flames flickering softly in the dim light. Corin realized that the real work had only begun. The valley and storms were behind them, but the wider world remained unpredictable. There were hunters, predators, and curious villagers, all potential threats or distractions. Still, he understood that the foundation of trust they had built, through patience, calm guidance, and unwavering protection, was strong enough to face what came next. By the time night fell, the hatchling was fully relaxed, wings draped over Corin, head resting on his chest. The human had become more than a stranger. It was a protector, a mentor, and a friend. And the hatchling, once abandoned and alone, had learned the first lesson of survival. That vulnerability could be met not with aggression, but with steadfast care, and that hope could be found in the presence of someone who simply refused to let go. Together, they rested, hearts beating in quiet synchronization, preparing for the challenges the new day would surely bring. The next morning, sunlight filtered through the cracks in the shed roof, casting warm streaks across the floor where the hatchling stirred, stretching wings that had grown noticeably stronger. Corin had already begun preparing a small breakfast, scattering water and fresh meat carefully for the little dragon, who eagerly lapped it up, tail twitching in contentment. Today, they would venture into the heart of the village, not merely to survive, but to begin claiming a place in a world that had once been hostile and frightening. Every step outside was deliberate, Corin's calm presence guiding, the hatchling testing its wings, learning to navigate human spaces without panic. Villagers peered cautiously from windows and doorways, murmuring among themselves, curiosity mingling with lingering caution. As they moved through the marketplace, the hatchling's confidence grew. Where before it would have huddled or hissed, now it chirped softly, responding to Corin's subtle hand gestures. Children gathered cautiously, enchanted by the shimmering scales and tiny sparks of fire that flickered harmlessly when it moved. Even merchants who had initially raised knives or dropped baskets now leaned forward, smiling, recognizing the bond between human and dragon. Corin spoke gently to them, explaining that the hatchling was orphaned and in need of care, emphasizing that trust and patience were more powerful than fear. Slowly, the community's stance shifted, all replacing apprehension. They began to see the hatchling not as a threat, but as a symbol of resilience, courage, and the unlikely bridge between human and dragon worlds. Midday brought a test neither could anticipate. A band of rogue hunters, drawn by rumors of a rare dragon in the village, approached with weapons gleaming and determination in their eyes. The hatchling froze, sensing the danger, wings fluttering nervously. Corin positioned himself between it and the hunters, arms raised in a steady, unwavering stance. "Stay back," he commanded, voice calm but carrying unmistakable authority. The hunters laughed at first, dismissing a single human as no match for a dragon. But the hatchling, feeling Corin's protection, let out a surprising burst of flame, not as a threat, but as a warning signal, synchronized with Corin's posture. Its small body radiated newfound confidence, and the hunters, wary of provoking unknown abilities, hesitated. Corin's calm control, paired with the hatchling's instinctive response, forced them to reconsider. They eventually retreated, leaving both human and dragon unharmed. The incident cemented a truth for both hatchling and villagers. Courage was measured not by size or weapon, but by trust, calm, and the willingness to protect when stakes were highest. By evening, the hatchling had grown visibly stronger and more self-assured. It played cautiously among the village alleys, occasionally returning to perch on Corin's shoulder or lap. The villagers began leaving food near the shed, small offerings acknowledging the unusual but welcome presence of a dragon in their midst. Corin taught the hatchling simple signals: when to take cover, how to signal danger, and how to respond to him without fear. Every gesture reinforced trust, and the baby dragon began to understand the value of guidance paired with patience. Its eyes, once clouded with abandonment and fear, now sparkled with curiosity and tentative joy. In the days that followed, a profound change took root. The hatchling no longer trembled at sudden noises or distant shadows. It had discovered safety in the human stranger who had become its guardian, mentor, and friend. Corin, in turn, realized that his role was far greater than providing food and shelter. He was shaping the first lessons of life, teaching the hatchling that trust and courage could exist even in a world that had once offered only cruelty. The village, once wary and fearful, had embraced them both, drawn to the remarkable bond forged through patience, protection, and unwavering care. And as night fell, the hatchling curled into Corin's arms, breathing softly, its small body warm and steady. In that quiet moment, abandoned pasts faded, leaving only a future built on trust, hope, and the extraordinary friendship between a human and a dragon who had found each other against all odds.